The rain came down over Duskhold like it meant to drown the whole keep. Sorrel barely felt it. She stood in the narrow servants' corridor outside the council chamber, one hand flat against the cold stone, the other resting low against her belly, where a secret no larger than a heartbeat had begun to grow. She had climbed 9 flights of tower stairs to reach this door. She had rehearsed the words the whole way up. Tonight, she would tell Varric that he was going to be a father. Then she heard her own name through the oak, and the world went still. At first, the voices were only a low rumble, the sound of old men deciding things in a warm room. Sorrel had learned long ago that a hearth healer heard everything and repeated nothing. She had not meant to listen. She lifted her hand to knock, and a single word stopped her fingers in the air. Ashfell. Her father's pack? Her dead pack? The name nobody in this keep ever said aloud, because saying it reminded them what she was. The last living ember of a bloodline the council had let burn. She pressed her ear to the wood without deciding to. An old voice spoke first, dry as parchment. The Frostfang will not sign. While blood remains unpaid, they demand a life for the peace. The hollow tithe must be filled, and it must be filled with someone this keep can spare. A murmur of agreement rolled through the chamber. 9 voices. The Council of the 9 Hearths, seated in judgment above her whole life. Sorrel's heart slammed against her ribs. She waited for Varric to laugh at them. She waited for the man who had held her under the ironwood trees and called her his hearth to tell 9 old men exactly where they could put their tithe. Instead, she heard his voice, low and even and terribly calm. Then record it, he said. Sorrel of Ashfell is the price the council demands. The corridor tilted. Sorrel gripped the stone to keep from falling. She did not hear the rest. She could not have heard the rest. The blood roared so loud in her ears that the world drowned beneath it, and the great doors were already groaning shut somewhere down the hall, sealing the men and their bargain inside. She heard a scent. She heard the scratch of a quill. She heard the word price in his mouth, in his voice, the voice that had promised her that no hall and no crown and no council would ever stand before her. He had weighed her. He had set her on the scale against a treaty. And he had let her fall. Sorrel stepped backward. Then again her hand had gone from her belly to her mouth, pressing her own scream back down her throat. She was a healer. She knew what shock felt like in another body. She had simply never felt it in her own. This cold flood pouring down through her chest and out to the tips of her fingers. She ran. Down 9 flights she went, past a startled maid, past a guard who called after her and got no answer, out through the low kitchen door into the storm. The rain took her at once, soaking her thin dress, plastering her hair to her face, and she was glad of it, because it hid the tears and it hid the smell of her, and it might, if the Hearth Mother was merciful, hide her scent from whatever they sent after her. Because they would send someone. A life owed was a life collected. She knew that. The way she knew her own name. Sorrel reached the outer wall and pressed herself into the shadow of the gate, shaking. One hand rose again to her stomach, to the small, warm secret she had carried up 9 flights of stairs to give to the father of her child. He would never know now. She would make certain of that. Whatever else the council took, it would not take this. It would not have her baby the way it meant to have her. She had come to Duskhold tonight to say 3 words. Instead, she pulled her hood low, slipped through the gate, into the black and streaming dark, and vanished from the only home her child would never remember. The forest swallowed her within 100 paces, and Sorrel let it. She had grown up in woods like these, before the fire, before the council took her father's land and gave her a servant's apron and a place at the bottom of another pack's table. Her body remembered how to move under trees, even when her mind had gone white with grief. Roots, mud, the black gaps between trunks. She ran until her lungs burned, and then she walked. And then, when walking became stumbling, she crouched in the hollow of a fallen ironwood and pressed both hands flat against her belly, and finally let herself break, not for long. Grief was a luxury, and she could not afford it. You cannot cry, she told. The small life inside her, though it could not hear and did not yet have ears to hear with. You cannot cry, because I am going to keep you, and to keep you I have to think. So she thought. She thought about the tithe, and how the Frostfang would want proof of it, a body or a bloodline ended, something to show their elders. She thought about how a woman alone in the woods was easy prey, but a woman carrying the Alpha King's child was something else, entirely, something the council would tear the world apart to erase before it could be born and named and set against them. A true blood heir was a claim was a threat, and the council did not suffer threats to live. They did not know yet. That was her one thin blade of hope. Varric had spoken of a sacrifice, not a child. If none of them knew she carried an heir, then she was only a servant who had run, and servants who ran were hunted lazily. If at all, she had to be gone. Before that changed, Sorrel pushed herself up. The rain had thinned to a fine cold mist, and through it the first gray of dawn had begun to bleed into the sky. She turned her face north and west, away from Duskhold, away from the Ironmoor lands entirely, toward the high broken country, where the maps ran out and no pack bothered to plant a flag. She had walked perhaps an hour when she heard it. A howl. Long, rising, deliberate, not the lonely cry of a wild wolf, but the call of a tracker who had found a scent and wanted his pack to know it. It came from behind her, from the direction of the keep, and it was closer than it had any right to be. Sorrel went cold all over. They had not waited for morning. They had not waited for anything. Someone had loosed a hunter the moment the gate guard reported a servant fleeing into the storm, and now that hunter was on her line, running the trail her own frightened feet had laid down through the mud. She did not run. Running left scent, and scent was exactly what he followed. Instead, she did the thing her father had taught her when she was small and the world was still whole. She found the stream. It took her a precious quarter of an hour to reach it. Every step, a lesson in patience, while her heart screamed at her to bolt. She stepped down into the icy water and began to wade upstream, against the current, letting the cold rob her legs of feeling and the moving water rob the ground of her trail. Another howl rose behind her, then a second voice answering it, and the sound of them dragged a whimper out of her that she bit down hard. Two now. There were two, sad. The stream bent left around a shoulder of gray stone. And there, half hidden by a curtain of hanging moss, the bank had collapsed into a shallow cave, no deeper than a wardrobe. Sorrel climbed into it, pulled the moss across the mouth with shaking hands, and folded herself into the smallest shape a body could make. She wrapped both arms around her middle. She slowed her breath the way she coached laboring mothers to slow theirs, and she waited. The hunters came down the far bank not long after. She could not see them through the moss, but she heard the wet crush of their paws, heard them cast about at the water's edge, where her trails simply ended, heard one of them let out a low, frustrated growl. A voice, human now, cursed the rain and the stream and the dark. Another answered that the warden wanted her found before she reached open country, alive if possible, quiet if not. The warden, Lord Brannock. Varric's own uncle, the man who had raised him. The second most powerful wolf in all the Ironmoor. He had sent them himself, in the black hours before dawn, for a servant who was supposedly worth nothing. Sorrel understood then, crouched in the freezing dark with her arms around her unborn child, that the men behind her knew exactly what she was worth, and that terrified her far more than any tithe. She stayed in the little cave until the voices faded north and the light grew strong enough to be dangerous. Then she slipped back into the stream and waded on, up current into country, with no name, carrying the one thing the Council of the Nine Hearths could not be allowed to find. 5 winters buried the woman Sorrel had been. She surfaced far to the west, in a gray fishing town called Marrowport, where the Ironmoor writ meant nothing and no wolf of standing ever came. She took a new name in the market square the first morning, plucking it off a fisherman's boat painted with the word Wren, and she wore it like a borrowed coat until it stopped feeling borrowed. To the folk of Merrowport, she was only Wren the Herbwoman, a quiet widow who had come over the mountains with a swollen belly and a haunted look, and asked no charity but a roof to rent. She earned that roof with her hands. She set broken fingers and drew fevers down, and eased the town's mothers through their hardest nights. And if she sometimes smelled of things no human nose could name, well, herbwomen were strange by trade. Nobody looked too closely at anyone. That was the gift of a place like Merrowport. The baby came in the deep of that first winter, in the back room of the rented cottage, with only an old midwife and a tallow candle for company, a girl. Sorrel held her daughter against her chest and wept, and this time she let herself, because the hunters were 400 miles behind her, and the child was here and breathing and hers. She named her Fenna. And Fenna, from her very first hour, wore the mark that could kill them both. It was there in the candlelight the night she was born, a single lock of hair among all the dark, pale as frost, bright as struck silver. The midwife had called it a blessing and touched it, for luck. Sorrel had smiled and thanked her, and lain awake till dawn, with terror sitting on her chest, because she knew that silver lock. She had seen it in the old tapestries at Duskhold, woven into the hair of every true-born Corvain, back to the first alpha who ever kept the first flame. It was the bloodline showing itself. It was Varric, stamped into their daughter, for anyone with eyes to read it. Storm-gray eyes came next, exactly his, and a temper to match, and worst of all, a wolf that stirred far too early. Most pups did not shift or slip until their 10th year, at the soonest. Fenna's wolf began pressing at her skin before she was 5, in flashes, when she was frightened or overjoyed, a ripple of something wild moving under a child's face. True blood ran strong and it ran fast, and Sorrel spent those 5 years teaching her daughter the most important lesson she would ever learn, which was how to be small, how to be quiet, how to never ever let the wild thing out where a stranger might see. "Do not shine, little ember," she would whisper, braiding the silver lock in among the dark to hide it. "The world is cold, and it hates a warm thing. We keep our fire inside." Fenna would nod solemnly, far too solemn for her age, and tuck herself down, and Sorrel's heart would break a little at teaching a child to fear her own light. But fear was what kept them alive. So she taught it, and Fenna learned it, and the two of them made a small, fierce life at the edge of the world, 400 miles east. The man who had lost them did not know either of them lived. Varric Corvain had grown into a cold and famous king. The stories that reached even Merrowport spoke of the Alpha of Ironmoor as a hard ruler, just but joyless. A wolf who had never taken a Luna and never smiled and never, the traders said, quite recovered from some private wound in his youth. Sorrel would hear these tales in the market and go on weighing dried thistle as though her hands were not shaking. And she would think, joyless, and hate the small treacherous part of herself that ached to hear it. She did not know what he believed. She could not have guessed. For in the version of events, Varric carried in his chest like a splinter of iron. Sorrel of Ashfell had not been sold. She had fled. His uncle Brannock had brought him the proof himself in those first raw days. A story with every seam sewn tight. The servant had been a Frostfang plant all along. She had crept into the keep to spy, charmed her way to the young king to secure her place, and run to her true masters in the north the instant her work was done. The child she was rumored to carry, if it existed at all, was no heir but a weapon, a false claim grown in secret to be thrown at his throne one day. Believe it or not, Brannock had told him, but do not chase her. To chase her is to admit she mattered, and a king who admits a spy mattered is a king the council will not follow. So Varric had not chased her, he had swallowed the splinter, and let it scar over and become the cold thing men feared. And every year, On the night she vanished, he drank alone in the high tower and told himself he hated her and did not once suspect that the hate was only grief wearing armor. In Marrowport, on a bright, hard morning in the 5th winter, that fragile, careful life cracked open in an instant. Fenna was in the market with her mother, holding the hem of Sorrel's cloak the way she had been taught, when a fish cart lost its wheel and tipped. A wall of crates came down toward a smaller child. A boy of 3 sat playing in the mud, and Fenna moved before thought, faster than any 5-year-old should move. And she was quick, because in the half-breath before she shoved the boy clear, her wolf surged up into her arms and her eyes, and lent her its strength. The boy was saved. The crates crashed harmless behind him, and across the square, a lean, gray-cloaked stranger, who had been buying nothing and watching everything, went very still, his gaze fixed on a small girl whose eyes had flared wolf gold in the sunlight, and whose dark hair carried a single lock of silver. Sorrel snatched her daughter up, and was gone into the crowd within a heartbeat. But she had felt that stare land like a brand between her shoulders. And she knew, with the cold and total certainty that had kept her alive for 5 years, that someone had finally seen the mark. The stranger did not come that night, nor the next. Sorrel packed anyway. She had a bag by the door that never fully unpacked, a habit 5 years old, and into it went the dried herbs and the coin she had hidden under the hearthstone and the small carved wolf Fenna slept with. She meant to be over the western hills before the new moon. She had done it before. She could do it again. But the thing that came to Marrowport came faster than she could run from it. It came in the gray hour before dawn, 4 riders, on lathered horses, and they did not knock. Sorrel woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of her neighbor's door breaking, and she was on her feet with Fenna in her arms before her mind had finished waking. Through the shutter slats, she saw them. Not Ironmore colors. No colors at all, which was worse. Because men who wore no crest were men sent to do things a crest could not be seen doing. They were going house to house, looking for a woman and a marked child. Someone had carried word east, and someone with a long reach had answered it. And now the careful invisible life she had built was burning down around her, one door at a time. Run, said every instinct she had. She did not run. She had learned that lesson in a cold stream 5 years ago. Instead, she wrapped Fenna in the dark cloak, pressed her mouth to the small ear, and breathed the old command. Do not shine. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, you keep your fire inside. Fenna's gray eyes were huge and afraid, but she nodded, because she had practiced being afraid quietly her whole short life. They went out the back, low, along the fish-drying racks, toward the boats, and they nearly made it. A man stepped from between 2 hulls, and he was smiling, and he had a length of iron chain wrapped around one fist. There you are, he said, soft and pleased. The warden will pay in gold for the pup. He might even pay for you. He reached for Fenna. Sorrel put herself between them and did not think about the odds. She was a hearth healer, not a warrior, but she was a mother, and a mother is her own kind of dangerous. She drove the heel of her hand up into the man's nose and heard it break, and when he staggered, she shoved Fenna toward the water and screamed at her to swim, to hide, to be small. Then the chain caught her across the shoulder and drove her to her knees in the wet sand, and a second man was there, and a third, and Sorrel understood with terrible clarity that this was where it ended, that she had bought her daughter perhaps 100 yards, and no more. She was wrong about where it ended. A horn sounded from the high road. Not the flat note of the crestless men, but something older and colder. A hunting call that rolled down over Marrowport and lifted every hair on Sorrel's arms, because her body knew that sound even after 5 years. It was the horn of Duskhold. The crestless men knew it too. She saw the smile fall off the one with the chain. She saw them look at one another and hesitate, and in that hesitation, a rider came down onto the beach like a piece of the night breaking loose. He was off his horse before it stopped. He moved through the three of them. The way wind moves through wheat, and it was over so fast that Sorrel, on her knees in the surf, could not properly follow it. One man was simply down, another fled and was allowed to flee. The one with the chain went last, and the rider held him off the ground by the collar and asked him one question, in a voice like a grave closing. "Who sent you?" The man gasped, "A name that the wind took." The rider dropped him, and he ran. And then the beach was quiet, except for the water and Sorrel's own ragged breathing. The rider turned. Dawn was coming up gray behind him. So at first she saw only the shape, tall and still, a drawn sword hanging forgotten from one hand. Then he took a step closer and the light found his face. And Sorrel's heart stopped in her chest for the second time in 5 years. Varek, older, harder, a scar through one brow he had not had before. But him, unmistakably him, the man she had run 400 miles to escape, standing on a beach at the edge of the world with her daughter's rescue still hot on his hands. He did not know her, she saw that at once. 5 years and a widow's gray and a healer's hard life had changed her enough that his eyes passed over her without the smallest flicker. Then a small wet shape came flying back up the beach because Fenna had not swum away. Fenna had never in her life left her mother in danger, and the child flung herself against Sorrel's side and turned to face the towering stranger with her chin up and her small teeth bared. Her hood had fallen back. The silver lock lay plain against her wet, dark hair, and her eyes, furious and frightened, burned the exact storm gray of the man standing over her. Sorrel watched Fair Corvan look down at the child. She watched the sword slip from his fingers into the sand. She watched every trace of the cold, famous king drain out of his face and leave something young and shattered behind it. "Whose child is this?" he said. His voice was barely a breath. "Whose child is this?" Sorrel did not answer him. She could not. Every lie she had built her life on stood or fell in the next few seconds, and her mind had gone as white and roaring as it had on the tower stairs. So it was Fenna who answered, in the way of children, with the truth. "She is mine," the little girl said fiercely, wrapping both arms around her mother. "And you leave her alone." The words seemed to strike Varek somewhere no blade could reach. He knelt slowly, there on the wet sand, bringing his ruined king's face level with the child's, and he did not try to touch her. He only looked and looked, as if he were reading a language he had thought was lost. The silver lock, the gray eyes, the stubborn jaw. Sorrel saw him counting, saw the arithmetic of 5 years happening behind his eyes, and she gathered Fenna up and rose on shaking legs before the sum could be finished. "We want nothing from you," she said, roughening her voice, leaning on the Western accent she had stolen. "You saved us, and we thank you. We will go now." She turned to leave. She had taken perhaps 3 steps when he spoke, and the accent she had built her safety on did nothing at all, because his voice broke on a single word. "Sorrel." She stopped. She did not turn. Behind her, she heard him get to his feet. "I would know your voice," he said, low and unsteady, in the dark, in a crowd, after 100 years. "I have heard it every night, for 5 of them." He drew a breath that shook. "They told me you were dead. Then they told me you were worse than dead. Turn around. Please, let me be wrong." She turned around. And she watched hope and horror fight across the face of the most powerful wolf in the north, and hope lose, because whatever he had been told, seeing her alive and holding a 5-year-old with his own eyes, was answering a question he had clearly spent 5 years being lied to about. They did not speak of it on the beach. There was no time. Later, on the long ride east, he would tell her the bitter joke of it. His own counsel had brought him word of a Frostfang threat on the western coast, a marked child, said to carry stolen royal blood grave enough that the king ride out and end it himself. He had crossed half the north to destroy a danger to his throne, and found his daughter instead. He did not yet understand that the men who sent him and the men who burned her street took their orders from the same hand, that he had been aimed at her like an arrow and very nearly loosed. The crestless men would carry word, and Marrowport was no longer safe for any of them, and Varek moved with the swift certainty of a man who had spent 5 years being obeyed. Within the hour Sorrel and Fenna were on horseback, wrapped in ironmore cloaks, riding east under armed guard, toward the last place on earth Sorrel wanted to go. She went because the alternative was the crestless men. She told herself it was only that. Duskhold rose out of the eastern hills 3 days later, gray and vast and exactly as she remembered, and Sorrel's stomach turned over at the sight of the tower where her whole life had ended. They gave her rooms in the guest wing, warm and guarded, and the guards, she understood, faced both ways. She was not quite a prisoner, and not remotely free. Fenna pressed to the window and watched the great wolves cross the courtyard below and said nothing, taking in this new cold world with the wary silence Sorrel had taught her. The keep learned of them within a day. And the keep's reaction told Sorrel everything. Lady Vesna came first. Sorrel remembered her, a high-born beauty of the House of Ryle who had circled Varek like a patient hawk even in the old days, and 5 years had only sharpened her. She swept into the guest wing uninvited, smiling, gracious, and her eyes went straight past Sorrel to the child, and something moved behind that lovely face that was not curiosity and was not spite. It was fear, cold and specific fear. Sorrel had spent 5 years learning to read exactly that expression on her own face in dark windows. "What a charming girl," Vesna said, and her voice was warm and her scent was ice. "And how old is she?" "5. Fenna is 5. Vesna's smile did not move, but her pupils did, contracting to points. A child of 5, with the corvain silver in her hair. Vesna did the same arithmetic Varek had done on the beach, and arrived in the space of one breath, somewhere that frightened her badly. "Does she speak much?" Vesna asked, too lightly. "Children that age, they imagine such stories." "Has she said anything, unusual, since you came? About where you have been? About who her father might be?" It was the wrong question, and Sorrel heard how wrong it was. Not is she well, not who hurt you on that beach. Not are you safe now. Vesna's very first concern, dressed in silk, was whether the child had talked, and to whom, and how much. It was the question of someone with something to lose, if the truth walked out of a 5-year-old's mouth. "She has said nothing," Sorrel answered, flat and careful. "She does not remember a father. She never had one." Something eased in Vesna's shoulders, there and gone. Exactly the way Sorrel's own fear eased when a danger passed her by. "Good," Vesna murmured, before she caught herself. "I mean, how sad for her." She recovered her smile and made her graceful excuses and left, and Sorrel stood at the window a long time afterward, with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, thinking. That night, unable to sleep, she went to fetch water from the well court, guards trailing at a distance. And in the dark of the cloister, she heard 2 voices she was not meant to hear. One of them Lady Vesna's, low and urgent, and the other older, a man's, dry as old parchment. A voice Sorrel had last heard through an oak door, telling 9 elders that a life must be spared. "The child changes everything," Vesna was saying. "If he claims her, the whole tithe unravels. The Frostfang will call the peace broken, and every soul in this keep will ask what truly happened 5 years ago." "Then the child cannot be allowed to matter," the dry voice answered. "Not the mother, and not the pup. See that it is quiet. See that it looks like the road, or a fever, or the sea. He does not sleep already. Let us not give him a reason to start hunting the truth." Sorrel stood frozen in the dark with the empty pail in her hands, and understood that she had brought her daughter into the very heart of the thing that wanted her dead. She could not run from Duskhold. That was the cruelty of it. The gates were watched, and the roads were watched, and a woman with a marked child had nowhere left in the wide world to go. So Sorrel did the only thing left to a cornered creature. She stopped trying to leave, and she started trying to understand. Varek made it easy and unbearable in equal measure, because Varek could not stay away. He came to the guest wing every day, at first with reasons, a question about the beach, a report about the fleeing men, and then, when the reasons ran out, with no reason at all. He never pressed her, never once demanded the answer written in silver across his daughter's hair. He simply came, and sat, and tried, with the clumsy patience of a man who had forgotten how to be near the child. Fenna hated him, or wanted to. She would go silent and hard when he entered, hood up, fire tucked deep inside the way her mother had taught her, and she would answer his gentle questions in single cold words and watch him the whole time as though he might lunge. Varek took it. That was the thing that undid Sorrel a little more each day. This king that armies feared sat on the floor of a guest room and let a 5-year-old despise him, and never once used his size, or his voice, or his crown, to make her stop. On the 4th day, Sorrel came back from the herb stores to find them both on the floor by the fire. Fenna had her carved wolves out, the little army she took everywhere, and Varek was holding one, turning it in his big scarred hands with enormous care. Sorrel stopped in the doorway, unseen, and listened. "Which one is this?" Varek was asking. "The biggest." Fenna considered whether to answer. "That is the one who watches," she said at last. "He stands at the edge and he watches, so the others are safe." Varek turned the little wolf. "And is he lonely, out there at the edge?" Fenna shrugged one shoulder, the way Sorrel did. "Somebody has to watch," she said. "Mama says the ones who watch do not get to be warm." Sorrel's chest tightened. "Does your mama watch?" he asked, very softly. "All the time," said Fenna. "She watches the door when she thinks I am asleep, and she watches the road." Varek went still. "What road?" he said. Fenna pointed at the window, at nothing, at the whole east. "That one," she said. "She looks at it and looks at it. I asked her once what she was waiting for." Varek did not move at all now. "What she said?" he asked. Fenna picked up another wolf and set it carefully in her row. "She said she was not waiting for anybody," said the child. "But then she cried, so I think she was waiting for somebody who threw her away." The words fell into the room like stones down a well. Sorrel closed her eyes against the door frame. And Varek made a sound she had never heard from him in the old days or the new, a short, broken breath, as though the small, honest sentence of a 5-year-old had gone into him further than any blade the crestless man could have carried. He did not know she was watching. He bowed his head over the little wooden wolf, this cold, famous king, and Sorrel saw his shoulders move, once, and she stepped back into the corridor before he could see her seeing him, because some things a person is not meant to witness. That evening, he found her alone on the gallery above the training yard. He did not sit. He stood a careful distance off, gripping the rail, watching the young wolves spar in the dust below. "I have spent 5 years being told a story about you," he said without turning. "Every part of it fit. Every part of it was reasonable. Powerful men brought it to me sealed and witnessed. And I was young and hurt, and I let it become the truth, because the truth was easier to hate than to grieve." He let out a slow breath. "And then I stood on a beach and heard you tell your daughter to hide her fire. And every part of the reasonable story turned to ash in my mouth." Sorrel said nothing. Her hands were white on the rail. "Vesna asks me daily when I will finish the alliance," he went on. "My uncle counsels patience, then counsels haste, then counsels patience again. And I have begun to notice that his counsel always arrives at the same place, which is you, gone, and the child unnamed." He turned at last and looked at her. "And I find I no longer trust the men who taught me what to believe. So I am asking you, not the king asking the servant, just a man who has been lied to for 5 years, asking the one person who was there." And there it was, laid open between them, the question the whole broken world turned on. Sorrel looked at the man who had sold her, or had not sold her, she no longer knew which, and felt 5 years of rage and grief and unbearable love rise up her throat all at once. "You want to know what happened?" she said, and her voice shook with the effort of holding it level. "You want me to tell you what happened?" "Yes," Farik said. "Please." Sorrel opened her mouth to tell him. And down in the yard, the great bell of Duskhold began to toll, hard and fast and wrong, the pattern that meant the gates were opening for a council in full session, and she saw Varric's face change, and she knew the moment was gone. "They are here," he said grimly. "All 9. His hand closed hard on the rail. "Whatever you were about to tell me tonight after. Do not let them take it from us again." Then he was gone down the stair to meet his council, and Sorrel stood alone above the darkening yard with the truth still burning unspoken in her mouth. The council sat that night in the long hall beneath the tapestries of dead kings, and Sorrel was made to stand before them. She had not wanted to go. Varric had not wanted her to go. But the summons came sealed by 9 hands, and to refuse it was to tell the council that the king was hiding something, and hiding a thing only made men hunt it harder. So she stood at the foot of the dais, in a borrowed gray gown, with Fenna's hand crushed in hers, and she looked up at the 9 old wolves, who had decided 5 years ago that her life was a coin to be spent. At the center of them sat Lord Brannock, older, heavier, but with the same dry, unhurried certainty she had heard through an oak door. He looked down at her the way a man looks at a stain he thought he had scrubbed out, and she understood that he had never once, in 5 years, expected to see her face again. The warden spoke first, and he spoke to Varric, not to her, as though she were furniture. "Nephew," he said gently, "the whole keep is unsettled. A vanished servant returns from the dead with a child of uncertain blood, and rumor does the rest. For the peace of the pack, and for the honor of your name, let us settle the matter plainly, and be done. The woman deserted her post 5 years past. The kindest course is to send her west again, with coin enough to keep her quiet." He smiled. "Let the past stay buried, where you yourself agreed it should lie." It was smoothly done. It offered Varric an easy road, and it painted Sorrel as a deserter in the same breath, and half the council was nodding before Brannock finished. Then Lady Vesna rose from her seat among the observers, graceful and grieved, and drove the knife. "My king," she said, "I speak only from love of you. But you must ask why she has come now, after 5 years, with a child she suddenly wishes seen. Coin, acclaim, a place at your side she could never earn honestly." She lowered her lovely eyes. "It is an old story. A serving girl, an heir invented to bind a king. I would be a poor friend if I did not say aloud what this whole hall is thinking." And there it was, the trap sprung, the 5-year-old lie dressed in new silk. Sorrel felt the hall turn against her, the way a tide turns. All at once, and without malice, simply because the moon of the moment pulled it. She had felt this exact turning before, in this exact courtyard, when she was only a servant, and a whispered word could cost her a meal or a beating. She knew how it went. The low-born woman kept her eyes down and swallowed the lie, and was grateful to survive it. She had swallowed a great many lies in this keep. She felt Fenna press into her side, small, and warm, and marked, and she felt something in her chest that had been folded small and quiet for 5 years begin at last to catch fire. "Enough," she said. The word cut across the hall louder than she meant it to. Every wolf turned. Brannock's dry composure flickered. "You want to know why I came now," Sorrel said, and she was not shaking anymore, because past a certain depth of feeling the shaking simply stops. "I did not come. I was dragged. Men with no crest burned my street, and put a chain across my back, and reached for my daughter. And they did it in your warden's name." She lifted her eyes to Brannock, and did not look away. "Ask him. Ask the warden whose gold pays crestless men to hunt a child 400 miles from here." The hall erupted. Brannock's face did not move, But Sorrel had spent 5 years reading faces for her life, and she saw the thing behind his eyes go cold and calculating and afraid. Varric was on his feet. "Is this true?" he said, and his voice had dropped into the register that made stone walls feel thin. "Uncle, did you send men to Marrowport?" "I sent men to investigate a Frostfang agent," Brannock said smoothly, recovering. "As I have investigated her for 5 years, on your behalf, to keep this exact chaos from your door. The child is the bait, nephew, she is the hook. I have only ever tried to spare you. Tapper?" And it was good. It was so good that Sorrel saw doubt move across the hall again, saw even Varric hesitate, because Brannock had had 5 years to make his lie fit, and she had only her word and a marked child. She felt the moment sliding away from her, the way the confrontation had slid away that afternoon. So she stopped defending herself, and instead she turned to Varric, and she said the thing she had sworn on a cold beach never to say to him again. "You told me once," she said, "that no hall, and no crown, and no council would ever stand before me. You said it under the ironwood trees, with your hand in mine. You are my hearth," you said. "No hall, no crown, no council stands before it." She watched the words land in him, watched his whole body go rigid. "Do you remember, or did they take that from you too?" The hall had gone utterly silent. "I remember," Varric said. His voice was barely there. "I have never forgotten one word of it. I have said it to myself in the dark more nights than there are nights." "Then how?" said Sorrel. And now the tears came, and she let them, because she was done hiding her fire. "Then how could you stand in that chamber and call me the price the council demands?" She spat the words back at him exactly as she had heard them, through the oak. "The price. I climbed 9 flights of stairs to tell you. I was carrying your child, and I stood at that door, and I heard my mate name me the payment for his peace. So do not ask me why I ran. Ask yourself why I should not have." And Sorrel watched the strangest thing she had ever seen move across Varric Corvain's face. Not guilt, not shame, something far worse. The pure white horror of a man who has just understood that the person he loves has spent 5 years dying inside over half of a sentence. "You heard me say that," he whispered. "You heard the price." He took a step toward her, gone gray as ash. "Sorrel, what else did you hear? Tell me exactly. What else did you hear me say?" "I heard enough," she said. "No," he said, and his voice broke wide open in front of 9 elders and his whole court. "You heard the beginning. Hearth-mother above, you ran on the beginning." He turned on his uncle with murder rising in his eyes. "Because someone made very certain you never heard the end." "Bring the record," Varric said. The hall stirred in confusion. Brannock had gone very still on his high seat. "What record?" the warden said, and for the first time the dryness in his voice had a crack running through it. "The record of that session," Varric said. 5 years ago, the night the council demanded the hollow tithe. Every full session is written down and sealed and kept. I want the writ of that night brought to this hall and read aloud." He looked at his uncle. "Unless the warden knows some reason it cannot be." The silence stretched. And in it, Sorrel watched the man who had raised the king make the smallest movement of his eyes toward the great doors, measuring the distance, and she understood that Brannock was, for the first time in 5 years, considering flight. He did not run. Perhaps he judged it would confess him. Instead, he spread his hands and summoned all his old authority. "Nephew, the archives of the council are not toys to be hauled out because a servant weeps. There are matters of state sealed in that vault that no—" "Bring it," Varric said. And this time, the alpha in his voice rolled through the hall like a struck bell. And 2 young wolves bolted for the archive tower without waiting to be told twice. They waited. No one sat. The great hall, built to hold the whole pack in judgment, seemed to hold its breath. Sorrel read the faces of the 9, the way she read a fevered patient, by the small involuntary things. 2 would not look at Brannock, and 2 could not look away from him. And that told her who had known and who had merely obeyed. Fenna, sensing everything the way children do, had gone silent and enormous-eyed. Against her mother's hip, Sorrel held her and watched Brannock, and did not let herself hope, because hope had cost her too much already, and she had learned in a cold stream and a colder town, that the moment you let yourself believe you were safe was the moment the world took the next thing from you. The writ came back, in a long iron tube, sealed with 9 faded wax crests. The senior archivist, an ancient, trembling wolf with ink-stained fingers, broke the seals before the whole hall, so that no man could say the thing was tampered with, and unrolled the vellum, and began to read the record of that night in a thin, clear voice. He read the council demanding the tithe. He read the elders naming Sorrel of Ashfell as the life to be spent, the last of a broken pack, a servant none would miss. Soul heard her own doom read out in a dead man's dry legal phrasing and felt Fenna's hand tighten in hers. Then the archivist read the words of the king, then, record it, the old wolf read. Sorrel of Ashfell is the price the council demands. He paused, wet his lips, and read on, and the hall stopped breathing. Record it, so that every hearth in every year to come remembers the night this council tried to sell the king's own mate to buy a coward's peace. I am Varric, of the line that keeps the first flame, and I tell you now before the 9, that I will not pay it. There is no treaty worth her. There is no peace worth 1 hair of her head. Strike the tithe, I refuse it wholly. And let it be written that any wolf who moves against her moves against his king. The hall exploded. Sorrel did not hear it. Sorrel was somewhere very far away, 5 years away, standing on a tower stair in the rain, with her hands over her ears against the roaring of her own blood, hearing the great doors boom shut, and thinking it was the sound of a bargain sealed. It had not been a bargain sealed. It had been her mate refusing to sell her, in words of such fierce love that the whole hall now sat stunned beneath them. Elders who had spent 5 years believing their king had bent to them, learning in a single read that he had defied them utterly and been robbed of the victory. And she had already been running down 9 flights of stairs. She had run on the first half of the sentence. The sound she had carried for 5 years as the sound of her doom had in truth been the only man who ever loved her. Turning to fight for her life, she had built 5 years of grief on a door that closed 1 heartbeat too soon. She made a sound she did not recognize as her own. Across the hall, Varric stood, white and shaking, and he was not looking at the writ. He was looking at her, and in his face was the same devastation she felt cracking open in her own chest, because he had just understood the exact shape of what had been done to them both. "You never knew I refused," he said hoarsely to her. "Only to her, though the whole council heard it. You ran that same night, and when I sent word to your quarters the next morning to bring you to safety, they told me your rooms were empty. They told me you had fled to the Frostfang." He turned to Brannock, and his voice began to rise. "They told me you were a spy, that the child was a weapon, that to chase you was to disgrace the throne." His hand was trembling. "For 5 years, I grieved a woman I believed had betrayed me, while you grieved a man you believed had sold you. And both of those beliefs were planted in us by the same hand." He rounded fully on his uncle now, and the whole hall with him. "You could not let her be found," Varric said, and every word fell like a stone, "because if I ever heard her side, I would learn I had refused the tithe, and that you buried my own refusal to force the peace you wanted. You could not let the child live, because a true-blood heir would prove the whole thing. So you told her I sold her, and you told me she fled. And you have spent 5 years and a river of gold making certain the 2 halves of that sentence never stood in the same room." He drew a breath that shook the air. "Until tonight." Brannock rose slowly from his high seat. The dryness was gone from him entirely now. What was left was older and colder and unashamed. "Everything I did," he said, "I did For the pack. Your father died in a war we could not win. I made a peace that has held for 5 years and saved 1,000 lives, and the only cost was one servant girl of a pack already dead. He looked at Sorrel with flat contempt. I would spend her again. I would spend 100 of her. That is what it is to rule, nephew. And it is why you were never fit. To the hall roared. And Varric Corvain, who had spent 5 years being cold, at last went perfectly, terribly warm. Take him, Varric said. The guards of Duskhold, who answered to the king and not the warden, moved before the council could draw breath. Brannock did not resist. There was a kind of contempt, even in the way he let them take his arms, as though being seized by lesser wolves was merely one more indignity of dealing with fools. They did not drag him out. Varric was not finished with him, and the whole keep needed to hear what came next. So they held him there at the foot of the dais, while the king assembled the ruin of 5 years, piece by piece, before the 9. It came apart quickly, once it began. The way a knot comes apart once the right thread is pulled, under the weight of the writ, and the fear of the Alpha over them. The lesser conspirators broke one after another. An elder confessed that Brannock had paid him to name Sorrel for the tithe in the first place, knowing she was the one soul in the keep no one would fight for. The archivist admitted, weeping, that he had been ordered to seal the true writ in the deep vault, and enter a false summary in the open ledger, so that any wolf who checked would read only that the tithe had been agreed. A captain of the guard, grey-faced, owned that the crestless men had drawn iron-more silver through a merchant house the warden controlled, and that the order 5 years running had been the same 3 words, "Find the pup." Sorrel stood through all of it with her daughter in her arms, and felt each confession land like a brick being lifted off her chest. She had spent 5 years believing herself a fool, a woman who had loved a man who weighed her against a treaty and found her wanting. Every confession told her she had not been a fool, she had been hunted. There was a strange, terrible mercy in it. Around the edges of the hall the servants had gathered, the maids and hearth hands, who had once been her only kin in this cold place, and she saw more than one of them weeping, and understood they had believed the lie, too, that for 5 years the whole keep had thought the quiet Ashfell girl a deserter and a spy. She watched the truth reach them one confession at a time, and she watched their faces change, and it was its own small mending. And then Vesna tried to run. She had been edging toward the side door through the whole unraveling, and when the captain named the merchant house, she made her move, quick and quiet in her silk. She did not reach the door. Fenna of all of them saw her go and cried out, and a guard stepped into the archway, and Lady Vesna of the House of Ryle was brought back into the light, with her composure gone, at last, her beautiful face bare, and frightened and ugly with it. Varric looked at her for a long moment. "You knew," he said. "It was not a question. You have counseled me toward this alliance for 5 years, and you knew every night what it was built on. You knew she lived. You knew the child was mine. And you smiled at me across 100 dinners, and let me believe I was alone in the world. I loved you," Vesna said, and it came out as a hiss. "I would have been a better Luna than a hearth witch from a dead pack. I would have given you strong sons and a peace that held. She stole your reason with one pretty face, and she was not even here. He chose her over the entire north." Her voice climbed toward a shriek. "What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to tell me the truth," Varric said quietly. "That is all. Any night in 5 years, one word." He turned from her as though the sight of her tired him. "That you did not is answer enough." He did not sleep that night, though the crisis had passed. Sorrel knew because she did not sleep either, and near the darkest hour she found him alone in the cold council hall, sitting on the steps of the dais, beneath the tapestries of his ancestors, with the unrolled writ across his knees, reading his own 5-year-old words over and over by a single candle. She sat down beside him on the step. She had not meant to. Her body did it before her pride could object. "I said all of that," he said, not looking up. I stood here, and I refused them, and I meant every word, and I walked out of this hall, certain I had saved you, and by the time I reached your rooms the next dawn, you were already 3 hours gone into the rain." He laughed, a small wrecked sound. "We missed each other by 3 hours." And then he spent 5 years making 3 hours into 5 years. They were both quiet. The candle guttered and threw their two shadows long and joined up the ancient wall, and neither of them moved to trim it. Somewhere far off, in the sleeping keep, a hound bayed once, and fell silent. "You did not sell me," Sorrel said at last, testing the shape of it. 5 years of certainty, turning over in her mouth. "All this time you never sold me. I would have burned the treaty, and the council, and the whole north to the waterline before I sold you," Varric said. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were red. "That is what makes it unbearable. Not that I failed you. That I did the one right thing I have ever done, and it still cost us everything, because a man I trusted stood between the doing of it and you." He looked back at the writ. "They were never rogues," he said softly. "Never strangers at the gate. They wore my colors and sat at my table and called me by my father's name. That is who took 5 years from us. That is who I have to live with, having loved. Word cannot be kept in a keep." By morning all of Duskhold knew, and by the second day the Packlands knew, that the warden had buried a king's own writ and hunted a true-blood heir across 5 years and 400 miles. The Council of the Nine Hearths convened in full one last time, no longer to judge Sorrel, but to be judged, and Varric called the whole keep to witness it, because a wound worked in secret can only be healed in the open. They gathered in the great courtyard under a hard, bright sky, the same courtyard where Sorrel had once carried water and kept her head down, and prayed to go unseen. She did not keep her head down now. She stood at the king's right hand, in a gown the color of banked coals, and Fenna stood between them, and the silver lock, that had been hidden for 5 years, lay plain and bright in the sunlight for every wolf in the north to see. Varric did not shout. Sorrel had learned that the coldest things he did quietly. "Lady Vesna of the House of Ryle," he said. The graceful woman was brought forward, and she had stopped pretending, and there was almost relief in her ruined face, at no longer having to smile. "You knew the truth, and you traded it for a crown you were never owed. You are stripped of your standing, your lands, and your name among us. You will leave Iremore before the sun touches the western wall, and you will not return while I draw breath. Go and be small somewhere. It is what you tried to make of her." Vesna went, and no one watched her go, which was its own kind of ending. Then Varric turned to his uncle, and the whole courtyard held its breath, because this was the true reckoning, and everyone knew it. Brannock stood unbound between two guards, straight-backed, contemptuous to the last, the man who had raised the orphaned king and taught him to hold a sword and read a treaty and trust the wrong people. For a long moment Varric could not speak, and Sorrel saw what it cost him, because whatever Brannock was, he was also the closest thing to a father the king had ever had. This was the man who had stood at his shoulder at his own father's pyre and taught him every hard lesson a king must learn, save the one that mattered most, to guard his heart from the people closest to it. There is no clean way to cut out a thing that grew that deep. Sorrel had lost her whole family to fire and the council in a single season, long ago, and even she felt the terrible weight of what the king was being asked to do to his own blood in front of the whole north. "You gave me a childhood," Varric said at last, very low, for the uncle and not the crowd. "You taught me the pack, and the hunt, and a long history of our line. I loved you." His jaw worked once before he went on. "And you looked at the one thing in all the world that was wholly mine, my mate, and my child. And you decided they were a price worth paying for your peace. You did not do it in rage, that I might forgive. You did it slowly, over 5 years, with ledgers and gold and patience, and you slept well every one of those nights. That I cannot." He did not order Brannock's death. Sorrel watched him choose it and set it aside, and she understood the choice, because a death would have been a mercy and an ending, and Varric meant to give his uncle neither. Instead, the king stripped him of the wardenship, of his seat among the nine, of his lands and his gold and every lever of the power he had murdered to keep. He would live out his years under guard, in a cold hall on the northern border, within sight of the very Frostfang he had spent so much blood to appease, with nothing to rule, and no one to hear him, and every long night to remember what he had thrown away. You wanted the North to remember your peace, Varric said. It will remember you as the man who sold a king's heart for it. That is the whole of your legacy now. Take him. They took him. He did not look back, and Sorrel found she was glad, because a backward look might have held something human in it, and she did not want to have to feel anything for him at all. When it was done, the courtyard was silent, 5,000 wolves, waiting to see what their king would do next. Anvada Corvene turned from the wreckage of his own family and knelt down, there in front of all of them, to the height of a 5-year-old girl. "Thena," he said. She looked at him warily, hood down, for the first time in her life. Fire, no longer hidden. "My name is Varric. I am not going to ask you to call me anything you do not wish to. But I want you to know in front of everyone here so that it can never be unsaid, that you are my daughter, and the blood of the first flame runs in you, and from this day no wolf living will ever again make you hide your light." He reached to the collar of his own tunic and drew out a thing he had worn for 5 years, a half-round of dark ironwood on a worn cord. From her own neck, Sorrel lifted its twin, the half she had carried 400 miles and never once taken off, and she did not remember deciding to. The two halves of the split hearth crust came together in a space between the king and the child, and they fit, of course they fit, and the joined seam of them said what no confession or writ ever could. The courtyard did not cheer. It did something older and deeper than cheering, slowly, in a great rustling wave that rolled outward to the farthest wall. 5,000 wolves went down onto one knee to the true blood heir of Ironmore. Warriors who had never bowed to anything, gray elders, stable hands, the very servants Sorrel had once worked beside, all of them knelt to the child with a silver lock. And Fenna stared around at the sea of bowed heads, with her storm-gray eyes, enormous, a girl who had spent every hour of her small life being taught to make herself invisible, now the still center of 5,000 souls. She looked up at her mother, uncertain, asking without words whether this too a thing to be afraid of was, and Sorrel, weeping openly at last, shook her head and then nodded, both at once. "It is all right, little Ember," she said. "You can shine now." The claiming did not mend it, and Sorrel did not pretend to herself that it had. A crown lowered and a courtyard kneeling did not reach back across 5 years and unmake a single one of the nights she had lain awake in Marrowport believing the father of her child had weighed her worth and found it small. The truth had changed everything and healed nothing, yet, and Varric, to his enduring credit, seemed to understand that better than she did. He did not presume. That was the thing that began, slowly, to undo the knot in her chest. A lesser man, cleared of the crime, might have expected the marriage restored the moment the writ was read, might have reached for her as though 5 years were an error, now corrected. Varric reached for nothing. He gave her the finest rooms in the keep, and asked nothing of them. He courted his own daughter one careful hour at a time, and let his mate keep the whole distance she needed. And every evening, without fail, he came and sat with them, and simply learned the years he had lost. He learned them all. He learned that Fenna's first word had not been mama, but boat, shouted at the Marrowport harbor from her mother's hip. He learned that she had nearly died of a winter fever at 2, and that Sorrel had sat awake 9 nights running to keep her breathing. He learned the name of the old midwife who had touched the silver lock for luck and sent her a pension for life without being asked. He learned that Sorrel had whittled the small carved wolves herself by candlelight, because a hunted child could own nothing traceable. Each thing he learned went into him like a stone, and he never once flinched from the weight of them, because he had decided, Sorrel came to see, that carrying the full knowledge of what he had missed was the only honest apology he had to give. And Fenna, who had begun by watching him, the way she watched all strangers, began by slow degrees to soften. It happened in the smallest ways. She let him fix the wheel on her favorite carved wolf. She began to save the best of her drawings to show him in the evening. One night she fell asleep against his arm instead of her mother's, and did not startle awake when she realized it, and Sorrel had to leave the room so that neither of them would see her face. One evening, near the turning of the season, they sat together on the western wall, the three of them, watching the sun go down over the hills that led, eventually, all the way back to Marrowport. Fenna had fallen asleep against Sorrel's side, worn out from a day of being, at last, a child who did not have to watch the door. "I have been trying to find the words," Varric said quietly. "For a long while now, there are none. I have looked." He turned the joined pendant over in his hands, the crest whole again on its mended cord. "I refused them, and I was proud of it, and I walked out of that hall certain I had won. I never thought to run to your rooms that very hour and carry you out myself. I trusted the morning. I trusted the men around me. My pride cost us the 3 hours, and my trust cost us the 5 years. Both were mine. I will not lay them on a dead pack's daughter who did nothing but hear a closing door." Sorrel was quiet a long time. Below them the light went gold and then rose and then gray. "I hated you," she said finally, "for 5 years. I taught myself to. Some mornings, hating you was the only thing that got me out of the bed and down to the market." She looked at him. "It is strange to sit beside the hated thing and find it was grieving you back the whole time. I do not know yet what to do with that. I do not know if the woman who walked out of the rain 5 years ago can walk all the way back." "I am not asking her to," Varric said. "I am asking nothing." He looked out at the darkening hills. "I spent 5 years certain I had lost you to your own choice, and that was a torment. This is not that, this is you, alive, beside me, free to stay or go, and our daughter safe and asleep and shining." He shook his head slowly. "I have not earned more than this. I only mean to keep earning for as long as you will let me, and to be content with whatever that buys, even if it never buys back what I threw 3 hours away." They sat until the first stars came. And then Fenna stirred against her mother, and half woke, and looked up muzzily at the two of them silhouetted against the last of the light, and she reached out one small, sleepy hand, and put it into Varric's enormous scarred one, the way a child does when it has decided, without telling anyone. Varric went, very still. Sorrel saw his throat work. He did not close his hand too fast or too hard. He let the small fingers rest in his palm as if a bird had landed there and might leave, and he looked at Sorrel over their daughter's head, with 5 years of grief and one fragile new thing rising in his eyes. It was not everything. Sorrel knew better than to call it everything. The nights in Marrowport were still real, and the 3 lost hours were still lost, and the long walk back to trust had barely begun. But the child slept between them with a hand in her father's, unafraid, unhidden, shining. And after 5 stolen years, a single unafraid hand felt very much like the beginning of a way home. Sorrel let her own hand come to rest over both of theirs, just for a moment, just to see how it felt. She was not promising him the whole road back. She did not know yet if it existed, or if some part of the woman who walked out of the rain would always stand a little apart, watching the door out of habit, older than reason. But her hand was warm on top of theirs, and her daughter was shining, and the man beside her had refused a whole kingdom rather than sell her, and had waited 5 years without ever once knowing she lived. It felt like the first warm thing in 5 long winters. It felt, very quietly, like a hearth being lit. Thank you so much for staying with Sorrel, Varric, and little Fenna all the way to the end of their journey. If this story of a stolen truth, a hidden heir, and a long road back to love moved your heart, Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss the next tale we tell together. And before you go, I would love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and do you believe some bonds can survive even 5 years of silence? Tell me in the comments below, because I read every single one, and it always warms my heart to see how far our little story family reaches. Until next time, guard your hearth, hold your loved ones close, and may the first flame light your way home.